Hello, my name is Lucy McKernan and I work for the Global Initiative for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. I'm the Geneva representative, so based here in Geneva, where I work with the human rights treaty bodies on economic and social rights. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate remotely in the strategic dialogue on women's human rights and climate justice. I'm really disappointed that I can't be there with you to meet you all and hear about the amazing work that you're doing. But I'm glad I'm able to contribute in a small way with a video message. So I've been asked to talk about opportunities to advance the work on women's rights and climate change within the human rights treaty bodies and in particular the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which is the committee that I work most closely with. So the human rights treaty bodies, of course, are the monitoring mechanisms for the international human rights treaties. And they have been doing quite a bit of work on climate change now since about 2010, making recommendations to states in the state reporting procedures and public statements as well in relation to climate change. And this work has culminated most recently in a joint public statement, which you may have seen, made by 5 human rights treaty bodies. That was the Committee on the Rights of the Child, CEDAW, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the Committee on Migrant Workers. And this statement was made in September this year, just before the Secretary-General's Climate Summit, and with the objective of trying to influence states as they went to that summit and talked about increasing their ambition with respect to their climate commitments. So it really was a groundbreaking joint statement, and it's unusual for 5 of the human rights treaty bodies to get together in that way and make a statement together. So I think it says a lot that the treaty bodies chose to do this in relation to the topic of climate change. And I wanted to just mention some of the key points under the statement. First of all, that the statement really articulated what states' human rights legal obligations are with respect to climate change. It talked specifically about obligations to reduce emissions to tackle climate change in order to protect human rights. It talked about what are the specific impacts on rights or the risks and threats to rights, the rights protected under the treaty, and in particular it differentiated disproportionate impacts on particular groups, including, of course, women. It also urged states to take human rights into consideration when they are articulating their climate change commitments, but also their actions or solutions for climate change. It welcomed the IPCC report on global warming of 1.5 degrees, and in particular the inputs from the scientific community. And finally, it also emphasised in particular the agency of particular groups, not just women, but also other groups, really emphasising that women should not be seen as just victims of climate change, but also agents of change and part of the solution to climate change, and emphasising that the participation of women, therefore, is really key in climate decision-making. And the statement concluded by saying that the committees have an ongoing role in relation to states' human rights obligations and climate change. And I think this was really an important statement for the committee to make at the end of this public statement, and an invitation, in fact, to civil society to keep working with the committees on this topic, because the committees really see that they have a role in articulating what the human rights impacts of climate change are, but also what states' obligations are in that respect. So I want to turn now to the work in particular of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Of course, I understand that others are addressing the work of CEDAW, who has also worked a lot on climate change. So the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, of course, monitors the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which protects rights such as the right to housing, the right to water, to health, cultural rights, the right to food, education, and so on. And as you can imagine, therefore, there is a very strong link between what we know are the predicted impacts of climate change and those rights protected under this particular covenant. I wanted to mention also that the committee has a very strong mandate on women's rights, and it has members of the committee who are very committed to addressing women's rights in all of their work. So we have Article 2.2, which is a general, this is of the covenant, which is a general non-discrimination provision. But we also have Article 3, which talks about the equal rights of men and women to the enjoyment of economic and social rights under the covenant. And as I said, the committee members have consistently tried to address or undertake their work in a manner which specifically looks at women's economic and social rights throughout their work. So for that reason, I think that the committee offers a really great opportunity for women's rights advocates who want to work specifically on women's rights and climate change. The issue of climate change, of course, is a newer one for the committee, like with other human rights committees. But I would say that the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has been one of the stronger ones on this topic, together with the CEDAW Committee and the Committee on the Rights of the Child. So, like the CEDAW, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has a state reporting procedure, and this is where we have seen most of the work that it has done on climate change. And like CEDAW, also the committee really relies on the inputs of civil society for the state reporting procedure. So it's really crucial that the committee has before it strong information from civil society in order that it can properly carry out its function in monitoring state performance under the covenant. So my organisation, the Global Initiative for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, together with an NGO called the Centre on International Environmental Law, have been working with the committees for a number of years now on climate change and human rights. And we've been doing this by submitting parallel reports to a number of the committees, describing the threats to human rights posed by climate change, and urging states then to take action to address climate change in order to protect human rights. We have focused a lot on developed countries, mostly, emissions reduction and other mitigation measures. We have not to date focused as much on developing countries or on adaptation. We've also undertaken a number of briefings for the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and for other committees, where we have tried to provide information to the committees about the analysis under the human rights treaties of climate change and what states' obligations are in the context of climate change, but also trying to point the committees towards resources that will be useful as they review states and when they bring up the topic of climate change. And I think, because of all this work that the committees have been doing gradually over the last couple of years, I think now that we're in a situation where where at least the Committee on the Rights of the Child, CEDAW and the SESCA have a much more sophisticated understanding of climate change and how it applies in the context of their work. So, as I said, we've been making submitting these parallel reports on climate change and human rights, and we've seen now quite a number of concluding observations come out of the committees, which have been really helpful, we think, in articulating the linkages. I wanted to read to you a couple of concluding observations just to give you a flavour of what the committees have said and of how, I think the committees have now begun to make very precise and specific recommendations, concrete recommendations that are relevant to the policy discussions within the state. I'll provide these in writing to the organisers as well, but I wanted to read to you a concluding observation by the SESCA to Argentina in 2018. It said, the committee expresses concern over the large-scale plans for the exploitation of non-conventional fossil fuels through fracking in the Vaca Muerta region. Considering that total exploitation of all the shale gas reserves with fracking would deplete a significant percentage of the global carbon budget for reaching the global goal of limiting the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, stipulated in the Paris Agreement. The committee is concerned that this fracking project goes against the state's commitments under the Paris Agreement, negatively impacting global warming and the enjoyment of economic and social rights of the global population and future generations. The committee recommends the state party to reconsider the large-scale exploitation of non-conventional fossil fuels through fracking in the Vaca Muerta region, so as to guarantee the fulfilment of its obligations under the Covenant and in light of the commitments of the Paris Agreement. The committee also encourages the state party to promote alternative energy and renewable energy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to set national goals with reference to parameters defined over time. So that was the concluding observation to Argentina. I'll just give you one more example. This was to Australia in 2018, relating to coal mines and coal exports. And I won't read the committee's concerns, I'll just go straight to the recommendations. It said, the committee recommends that the state party revise its climate change and energy policies, as indicated during the dialogue. It recommends that the state party take immediate measures aimed at reversing the current trend of increasing absolute emissions of greenhouse gases and pursue alternative and renewable energy production. The committee also encourages the state party to review its position in support of coal mines and coal exports. The committee further recommends that the state party address the impact of climate change on Indigenous peoples more effectively, while fully engaging Indigenous peoples in the related policy and program design and implementation. So I won't read any more, but another example is when the committee reviewed Switzerland this year. It made concluding observations specifically looking at the role of financial actors and financial flows, and how Switzerland should take action to regulate financial flows to be consistent with commitments under the Paris Agreement. We've also seen concluding observations to Japan, looking again at coal energy, and particularly in relation to children's rights. And there are many other examples. I wanted to refer you to a document that my organisation has published together with the CL, which we call the Synthesis Note. It was published, it's been published twice now, the most recent version in February 2019. It's available on our websites, and it's a compilation of all of the concluding observations of the treaty bodies on climate change to date. So that might be useful for you to understand, what the treaty bodies have said and what might be possible if you're interested in pursuing this avenue in your advocacy. So I wanted to turn now to the optional protocol and quickly mention the work of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights through its complaints procedure. Unfortunately, there haven't been any cases submitted yet that I'm aware of before the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, specifically dealing with climate change. But I mention it as another opportunity for advocacy and accountability under the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. The difficulty with this procedure, unfortunately, is that it has very low ratifications. That means that a very small number, 25 in fact, states have signed on to this particular procedure, which means there are limited opportunities to bring cases against a limited number of states under the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. I finally wanted to mention the committee's work in relation to general comments. So general comments, as you may know, a bit like what the CEDAW calls general recommendations. General comments are authoritative statements by the committee which provide guidance to states and other stakeholders about the interpretation of the covenant. And usually when the committee is developing new general comments, there is a process for consultation and participation and engagement by stakeholders who are interested in the particular topic. So the committee is currently has two general comments that it is developing that are relevant to the topic of climate change. One is a general comment on land and economic and social rights, and the other is a general comment on sustainable development and the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And as you can imagine, both of these have strong linkages to the topic of climate change and women's rights, And so there are opportunities to engage with those processes and make submissions to the committees as they develop this general comment. And if people are interested, please feel free to get in contact with me and I can let you know what opportunities there might be there. Finally, I wanted to mention the work of the Human Rights Committee. And this is because the Human Rights Committee has recently developed a new general comment, number 36, on Article 6, which is the right to life. And this new general comment is important because it really expanded the understanding of the right to life beyond its quite narrow understanding previously to one that encompasses economic and social dimensions and, importantly, environmental and climate dimensions. And there's some specific wording in the general comment which talks about the linkages between the right to life and environmental pollution and climate change. So this is a really important advance in the jurisprudence on the right to life, and it's particularly important because, of course, the right to life is a right that's protected very, very widely throughout the world, in the majority of constitutions throughout the world. So because of this, we think, and also because, I should say, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, of course, is very well ratified throughout the world. So most states are a party to that particular covenant. So I think there is an opportunity here, both through the state reporting procedure and through the optional protocol, the complaints mechanism of the Human Rights Committee, to bring the issue of climate change before that committee and to really emphasise that climate change now threatens the right to life. And in particular, in relation to the optional protocol, I mention this because, unlike the optional protocol for the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which has low ratifications, the one for the Human Rights Committee has very high ratifications. And so there are much more opportunities to bring a case against a state under this optional protocol. And one case has already been brought that we're aware of. That is a case against Australia, brought by the Torres Strait Islander community. Some of you may have heard about this, and I can provide again links to some of the information about that case. But it's an important case because it alleges that for this Torres Strait Islander community, which is in the north of Australia, and where sea level rise is threatening the community that lives there, in fact, to the point where it's possible the people will have to be moved to the mainland of Australia because their islands are literally going underwater. And so what the community alleges in their complaint is that the Australian government is not doing enough to address climate change, and that climate change is threatening, therefore, their right to life. They also raise issues in relation to cultural rights because, of course, they talk about their very strong connection to the land where they currently live, which, if they have to move to the mainland, will be irreparably broken. So that's an important case to watch and an example of what might be done in relation to the Human Rights Committee advocacy. So in conclusion, I'll wrap up by saying I think there are lots of opportunities to engage with the human rights treaty bodies, in particular with the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in relation to climate change and women's rights. I think the opportunities are through the state reporting procedure and the complaints procedures to increase the pressure on states to take action on climate change in order to protect human rights. But also, and something I haven't talked about as much, but I think is equally important, to increase the pressure on states to make sure that when they are taking steps to address climate change, when they are putting in place climate solutions, climate projects, that they ensure rights are protected in that process. And, we've seen far too many examples where states' climate actions have had an adverse and negative impact on human rights. I think it's also these mechanisms can be used to raise awareness amongst states about what are the key linkages, what specifically are the linkages between women's rights and climate change, because I think there's a broad understanding of that, at least at the international level, but less understanding about what that means at the national level, at the ground level, how rights are actually being impacted and what a women's rights perspective brings to the discussions on climate change. I think also that there's opportunities to input into the committee's work as they start to define what states' human rights obligations are in the context of climate change. So, this is something that's evolving now, and I think it's really important that women's rights advocates are part of that discussion and make sure that as those obligations are defined and articulated by the committees, that they have the benefit of a women's rights perspective as well. And finally, I wanted to mention that there are some substantive areas that the human rights treaty bodies have not yet really addressed very much in relation to climate change. So in particular, deforestation is something that has not received a lot of attention, but it obviously is really crucial. Issues relating to Indigenous people's rights. I think there has been a little bit of work done on this with the human rights treaty bodies, but not a lot, and I think a lot more could be done to articulate what states' obligations are with respect to Indigenous peoples in particular, and clearly Indigenous women's voices will be really crucial in those discussions. And as I said, more generally, a women's rights perspective on climate change and a real, a more detailed unpacking of what how women's rights are threatened by climate change, but also how climate solutions must include a women's rights perspective. I think there's a lot of work to be done also from women's rights advocates in that respect with the human rights treaty bodies. So I'll end there. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you. As I said, I'm really disappointed not to be there to meet you and to hear about all the amazing work that you're all doing in this space, and I really hope to connect with you at some stage. Please, if you're coming through Geneva, please get in touch. I'd love to meet with you, and good luck for the remainder of the dialogues. I wish you every success. Thank you. Goodbye.